There are moments when you look at the world around you and wonder who is really moving the strings. You walk down a crowded street and see faces absorbed in their own lives, each one believing they are steering their choices. Yet if you pause long enough, if you let your thoughts stretch beyond the surface of daily routine, a different suspicion begins to stir. Perhaps the truth is stranger than the quiet assumption that you alone hold the wheel of your life. Perhaps reality itself is not as neutral, not as independent as you've been taught to believe. The question then sharpens like a blade against the stone of doubt. Who is actually controlling reality right now? And more importantly, what does that control look like when you strip away the comforting illusions to even pose the question feels unsettling. We are trained from early childhood to think of life as a straight path, one that unfolds as a consequence of effort, discipline, and chance. But if that were the full picture, why does reality so often bend in directions that feel scripted, uncanny, or carefully staged? Why do coincidences repeat with such unnerving accuracy? Why do events far beyond your control still shape the texture of your inner world, as if guided by an unseen rhythm? When you examine this long enough, you begin to sense that control is not a single hand pulling invisible levers, but a web of forces, some intimate and others vast, intertwining in ways that blur the line between the individual and the cosmic. The very idea of control must be unraveled before we can approach the answer. Control does not always mean domination, nor does it always imply conscious direction. It can exist as influence, as the subtle pressure that pushes you one way instead of another. It can live in memory, shaping your expectations before you act. It can hide in language, in the quiet weight of the words you use, carrying entire histories that bend how you interpret the world. Control may even dwell within you, not as a singular self, but as the countless voices and impulses that make up the fragile construction you call identity. When you look closely enough, the idea that you are in full command begins to dissolve, and the question becomes less about who rules reality from a throne and more about which patterns, visible and invisible, constantly sculpt the texture of your experience. Reality itself is slippery. It feels solid when you touch the table in front of you, yet modern physics whispers that the solidity is only a vibration of energy fields. It appears stable when the sun rises every morning, yet history shows that civilizations rise and fall as if tossed round by hidden currents. Reality, at least as we know, it is not a monolith. It is a dynamic stage built out of perception, memory, and collective agreement. To say someone or something is controlling it is to admit that reality is pliable, malleable, open to being shaped. Once you accept that possibility, a door opens. Through that door, unsettling and liberating possibilities rush in like cold air from another world. Consider, for a moment, that control may not reside only in governments, corporations, or shadowy elites, though these certainly exert their influence. Consider that control may also flow through subtler dimensions. The stories we inherit, the symbols we unconsciously obey, the patterns of desire instilled by culture. These are not forces you can point to on a map, yet they govern with astonishing precision. They determine what you find meaningful, what you dismiss as irrelevant, and what you dare not even imagine. If control is measured by the ability to shape your sense of possibility, then these hidden architectures wield far greater influence than any single ruler or organization. There is also the unsettling possibility that the control of reality is not external at all but internal, projected outward like a dream. You may walk through life convinced that the world is fixed, yet every experience you have is filtered through your own perception, the colors you see, the sounds you recognize, even the sequence of time itself. These are interpretations shaped by your brain, not absolute truths. If your inner world shifts, the entire fabric of reality seems to shift. With it, in this sense, you might be both the prisoner and the warden, both the dreamer and the dreamed. The deeper you explore, the more the lines blur. Is reality controlled by outside forces? Or are those forces simply reflections of your own hidden depths? This duality between inner projection and outer manipulation forms the heart of the mystery. Throughout history, mystics and philosophers have spoken in metaphors about veils, shadows, and mirrors. They suggest that reality is not controlled in the way a puppet master controls marionettes, but in the way a river shapes its banks, slowly, steadily, with currents invisible to the eye. You cannot escape these currents, but you can learn to sense them. You can begin to notice how thought patterns, cultural codes, and even the collective mood of humanity bend the path of events. The question who controls reality begins to dissolve into a more profound realization. Reality is not controlled by one entity, but is co-created by countless layers of influence, woven into a tapestry too vast for any single perspective to fully grasp. Still, this does not mean the question is without urgency. If you do not ask, who controls reality, you risk becoming nothing more than a passenger, swept along by currents you cannot see. You accept what is given, mistaking the script for spontaneity. You confuse the map for the territory. By asking even if the answer remains elusive, you awaken a sharper vision. You begin to notice the patterns of influence that surround you, and in that noticing lies the first step toward freedom. The power to shape your own slice of reality does not come from denying influence, but from recognizing it. When you see the threads, you can decide which ones to follow, which to cut, and which to weave into something new. In this light, you won't believe who's actually controlling reality right now is not just a provocative phrase. It is an invitation to peel back the layers of perception and influence that shape your existence. It is an opportunity to question the surface story, to look behind the curtain of appearances, and to confront the strange fact that control is everywhere and nowhere at once. The ones who control reality may be powerful institutions, invisible cultural scripts, or even the quiet machinery of your own mind. Perhaps it is not a matter of choosing one explanation, but of learning to live with the paradox that all are true, each in their own way. To explore this further, we will need to move carefully. We will need to trace the core themes and concepts that define what it means for a reality to be controlled, how influence manifests, and why these forces remain hidden in plain sight. The journey ahead is not about uncovering a single villain or savior, but about revealing the complex interplay of forces that guide the rhythm of existence. Only then can the full question be understood. To approach the question of who controls reality, you first need to understand what is meant by reality itself. On the surface, reality seems straightforward. It is the world you wake up to each day, the collection of sights, sounds, and experiences that feel solid and unquestionable. Yet the more closely you examine it, the more it reveals itself as a fragile construction, stitched together by perception, memory, and collective agreement. Reality, in this sense, is less like a fixed object and more like a shared story. If that is true, then the one who controls reality is not necessarily the one with the loudest voice, but the one who shapes the story everyone else agrees to tell. This brings us to the first theme: perception as a filter. You never encounter reality directly. You only encounter your perception of it. The colors you see are wavelengths interpreted by your brain. The sounds you hear are vibrations converted into meaning. Even the passage of time, which feels so natural, is processed through the structures of memory. In short, the reality you experience is a version of the world sculpted by the limits of your perception. If someone learns to influence that perception through symbols, language, or carefully designed environments, they are, in effect, shaping your reality. This is why propaganda, advertising, and cultural narratives hold such power. They do not change the physical world, but they change how you see it, and thus how you respond to it. The second theme is collective agreement. Reality is not just personal. It is also social. You live within a shared framework of meaning, a set of assumptions that everyone around you takes for granted. Money, for instance, is only valuable because everyone agrees it is. Laws only function because people collectively act as if they are binding. Even moral codes depend on consensus, shifting as societies evolve. Whoever can steer this collective agreement by setting the terms of debate, defining acceptable norms, or controlling the flow of information exerts an extraordinary form of control over reality. The rulers of old did this through religion and tradition. Today it is often accomplished through media, algorithms, and global networks that quietly shape what people believe to be true. A third theme rises when you recognize the tension between illusion and deeper truth. Many traditions, from Eastern philosophies to modern science, suggest that what you perceive is a kind of illusion, not a deliberate deception, but a simplified version of reality designed to help you survive. You see solid objects because it is useful, not because matter is truly solid. You perceive a self because it organizes your experience, not because the self exists as a permanent entity. If reality is already an illusion at the perceptual level, then the question of control becomes even more complex. Is someone truly controlling reality, or are they simply manipulating the illusions you already live inside? And if that is the case, how can you tell the difference between control and the natural limits of perception? The fourth theme is the paradox of freedom. You may feel free in your daily choices, yet those choices are shaped by influences you did not choose. Your desires are shaped by culture, your fears by past experiences, your sense of possibility by stories handed down long before you were born. Even your sense of individuality is partly a construct of the society you live in. The paradox is that while you do have agency, that agency exists within boundaries you rarely notice. Those boundaries are the true levers of control. Whoever defines what feels possible, reasonable, or inevitable holds more sway over your life than anyone issuing direct commands. Control, then, is not always a matter of force, but of narrowing the range of what you believe you can choose. Another theme to consider is the role of hidden systems. Reality today is deeply entwined with technological and informational systems that operate largely out of sight. Algorithms decide what news you see, what products you encounter, even what people you meet online. Supply chains, financial networks, and data structures shape the world around you without your direct awareness. These systems may not be run by a single person or entity, yet they act as invisible architects of reality. They control not by telling you what to believe, but by silently determining what options appear before you in the first place. Finally, there is the theme of inner control. While external forces shape much of your reality, the inner landscape of thought and emotion is equally powerful. If you believe yourself powerless, reality seems to confirm it. If you cultivate awareness, reality shifts in response. This is not mystical thinking, but a recognition of how perception creates experience. You are both subject to control and a participant in it. The very act of questioning who controls reality places you in a different relationship with it. In this sense, control is not a single force pressing down from above, but a dynamic interplay between outer influence and inner awareness. Taken together, these themes reveal that the control of reality is not a single answer, but a layered phenomenon. It exists in perception, in collective agreement, in the illusions of the senses, in the boundaries of choice, in hidden systems, and in the inner act of awareness itself. To ask who controls reality is not to seek one culprit, but to uncover the architecture of influence that weaves together the world you inhabit. The deeper challenge is learning to see these layers without becoming lost in them. If reality is a shared story, then every story can be rewritten. If reality is filtered perception, then every perception can be questioned. if control exists through boundaries. Then freedom begins when you notice those boundaries. The very fact that you can think about these themes is proof that you are not simply a passive observer. You are part of the shaping, part of the weaving. Whether or not you admit it, stories have always been the secret architecture of reality. Long before people spoke of algorithms or global networks, myths and allegories carried truths about who or what control the visible world. These narratives were never meant to be taken literally, but rather as mirrors reflecting the deeper mechanics of existence, to move closer to understanding who controls reality now. It is useful to linger in these symbolic tales, for they reveal patterns that repeat across time and culture. One of the oldest narratives is that of the puppet master. Ancient plays and shadow theater performances hinted at a world where the visible actors were not the true movers behind the screen, and seen hands guided the strings, shaping the illusions on stage. In a sense, this is the way many people still experience reality today. They walk upon the stage of daily life, speaking their lines, yet they feel that unseen powers, whether economic, political, or cosmic, pull the strings. This allegory does not need to be literally true to resonate. The image of the puppet master reminds you that much of what appears spontaneous may in fact be guided by structures hidden from view. Another symbolic thread comes from the ancient image of the veil. Philosophers and mystics have long suggested that reality is covered by a thin veil of appearances, concealing a deeper truth. To lift the veil is not simply to gain new information, but to experience a radical shift in perception. In this narrative, control belongs to those who weave the veil and keep it in place. They may not dictate every event, but they control what can be seen and what must remain hidden. The veil, then, becomes a symbol of cultural conditioning, social narratives, and personal blind spots. It is not malicious by necessity. It simply shapes the contours of what you take to be real. Consider also the allegory of the labyrinth. In myth, the labyrinth is a place of confusion, filled with twisting passages and deceptive turns. It represents a reality so complex that the one trapped inside cannot easily tell truth from illusion. Within the labyrinth lives the Minotaur, a force of fear that keeps the wanderer disoriented. Control here is not exercised through direct command, but through architecture, by designing the very environment in which choices must be made. Today, the labyrinth could be seen as the overwhelming flood of information, choices, and systems you must navigate. The more entangled you become, the more your attention is consumed, and the less freedom you seem to have. The power lies in designing the maze, not in chasing its inhabitants. There is also the parable of the mirror. In many traditions, the world is described as a mirror reflecting your inner state. If you carry fear, you find fear mirrored back to you. If you cultivate clarity, the mirror returns clarity. In this symbolic frame, control is not imposed from the outside but emerges from within. The world bends itself, in subtle ways, to the texture of your consciousness. This allegory undermines the simpler idea of external controllers by suggesting that the true source of reality's shaping force is the mind itself. Whether or not this is literally true is less important than the insight it delivers. Your perception co-creates your reality, and therefore your inner state wields more influence than you often recognize. Yet perhaps the most haunting symbolic story is the tale of the dreamer. In many philosophies, reality itself is likened to a dream. Just as in dreams, events unfold with their own logic, often strange yet unquestioned until awakening. If reality is a dream, then who is the dreamer? Are you the one dreaming, or are you a character in someone else's dream? The unsettling possibility is that both are true. You are a fragment of a larger dreaming mind, and at the same time, you hold the capacity to awaken within the dream. This allegory casts control not as domination, but as participation in a collective dreaming process. To awaken even slightly within it is to recognize your power to shape the dream from within. These symbolic narratives, puppet master, veil, labyrinth, mirror, and dreamer do not compete with one another. Instead, they point to different aspects of the same mystery. They reveal that control over reality is multifaceted. Some control comes from outside forces shaping environments and perceptions. Some rises from within, as the mind projects its beliefs outward, and some is so deeply woven into the structure of existence that it cannot be separated into simple categories of inside or outside. The true power of these stories is not in providing an answer, but in expanding the way you frame the question. What makes these allegories enduring is their relevance across eras. Even in today's hyper-connected, digitized world, you still encounter puppet strings in the form of algorithms. You still confront veils in the form of narratives that conceal inconvenient truths. You still wander labyrinths of endless options and conflicting signals. You still see the mirror in the way your thoughts shape your experiences, and you still find yourself wondering if life is a dream, with layers upon layers of dreamers, none of them fully awake. These symbols endure because they describe structures of influence that are timeless, repeating regardless of the tools or technologies of the age. To dwell on these symbolic narratives is not to indulge in abstraction, but to gain a different form of clarity. They remind you that reality cannot be controlled in a simplistic way. It is not a machine with one operator, but a living field shaped by visible and invisible hands alike. They suggest that control is not only something done to you, but also something you participate in, whether consciously or not. The more you see yourself within these allegories, the more you begin to understand the subtler forms of control that weave through your own life. The task ahead, then, is to move from these metaphors into their practical echoes in the real world. If reality is a labyrinth, how do you navigate it without becoming lost? If it is a mirror, how do you refine what it reflects? If it is a dream, how do you awaken within it? These questions bring us naturally to the next phase of exploration, where symbols meet daily life, and the hidden mechanics of reality control become tools for conscious engagement. It is one thing to linger among metaphors of puppet masters, veils, labyrinths, mirrors, and dreamers. It is another to bring those images into the light of daily life, where decisions are made, routines are followed, and countless influences move silently through you. If reality is shaped and controlled in subtle ways, the most practical question is not merely who controls it, but how you can recognize and respond to these forces without becoming their silent captive. Begin with perception, the most immediate layer. Every advertisement, every headline, every carefully designed app on your phone is competing for your attention, not simply to inform you but to shape the lens through which you interpret reality. If you believe the world is in constant crisis, you will see crisis everywhere. If you believe your value depends on consumption, you will measure your worth by the things you buy. Control in this sense operates by narrowing perception, by steering your awareness towards certain patterns and away from others to reclaim some measure of agency. You must practice the simple discipline of noticing. Notice the effect of images on your emotions. Notice how words shift your state of mind. Notice what triggers your sense of urgency and what quietly numbs you into passivity. Awareness itself does not free you from influence, but it loosens its grip. Next comes collective agreement, which shapes the very framework of what you consider normal. Much of what you accept as reality is not natural law but convention. Money is paper and code, given meaning only because people collectively treat it as valuable. Laws have force only because societies agreed to enforce them. Even the passage of time is measured according to conventions of calendars and clocks. Recognizing this does not mean rejecting the agreements you cannot live outside them entirely, but it does mean you can see them for what they are, shared fictions that gain power through consensus. Once you see that, you can engage with them more consciously. Rather than mistaking them for unchangeable truths, technology and hidden systems provide another layer of reality control. Algorithms decide what reaches your eyes and ears, shaping not only your knowledge but your desires. They filter the world so that you rarely see it raw. Instead, you see a curated version designed to maximize engagement. This does not require conspiracy to function as control. The architecture itself ensures that what you notice, believe, and act upon is already being shaped before you even realize it. To live within such systems without losing your ground requires deliberate habits, diversifying your sources of information, creating space away from constant digital input, and remembering that what appears on your screen is not the world but a filtered echo of it. The allegory of the labyrinth appears here with sharp clarity. You live inside a maze of options, constantly nudged in directions that benefit systems larger than yourself. You can choose, but only from within the corridors laid out before you. The trick is not to break the maze, for that may not be possible, but to learn its structure. When you see how the paths are designed, you gain the power to decide more consciously which direction to walk. Control in this context is not eliminated, but it becomes visible, and visibility is a kind of strength at the same time. The mirror narrative teaches that control is never purely external. Your inner state co-creates your outer experience. If you approach the world in fear, you will find fear reflected back. If you cultivate steadiness, you will find clarity more available. This is not about magical thinking, but about the way attention shapes perception and perception shapes response. When you learn to regulate your inner state through reflection, mindfulness, or simple pauses before reacting, you discover that reality bends in response. It does not erase external forces, but it changes how they meet you. The world feels less like an oppressive weight and more like a dialogue between your inner and outer landscapes. The dreamer allegory adds another layer, the possibility that reality is not something you merely endure but something you can awaken within. To live unconsciously is to play your role without question, to follow the script as written. To live with awareness is to notice the script itself, to realize you can improvise, resist, or even rewrite portions of it. This does not mean you control every outcome. The dream is too vast for that. But it does mean you can participate actively, shaping your corner of reality rather than drifting passively through it. Even small acts of conscious choice ripple outward, shifting the collective dream in ways you may never fully see. Bringing all of this together, the practical integration of these ideas is less about overthrowing control and more about navigating it wisely. You cannot escape perception, collective agreement, or hidden systems. You cannot dissolve the labyrinth or erase the veil, but you can recognize their presence, engage with them critically, and cultivate an inner clarity that prevents you from being entirely defined by them. Reality may be controlled in countless ways, but the act of awareness introduces a margin of freedom. That margin, though small, is where your true agency lives. The implications are far-reaching. If you understand that reality is a shared story, you might choose to tell different stories, ones that expand possibility rather than shrink it. If you understand that systems shape perception, you might step outside their grip long enough to glimpse the world without filters. If you understand that your inner state reflects outward, you might take responsibility for what you carry within. In each case, control does not vanish, but it shifts. The balance between external influence and internal participation tilts ever so slightly in your favor. This is not about liberation in some absolute sense, for absolute freedom may be an illusion. It is about cultivating enough awareness to move through the currents of reality without drowning in them. It is about recognizing that you are shaped by forces larger than yourself. You are not powerless within them. You remain a participant, a co-creator, a voice within the larger chorus of reality. To see this clearly is to hold both humility and strength. Humility in recognizing the vastness of the systems around you, strength in recognizing your ability to respond consciously within them. At the end of this long inquiry, you may notice something shifting. The question that first appeared as a provocation, you won't believe who's actually controlling reality right now, has transformed into something more intricate and unsettling. You began by imagining a single force, a hidden ruler, perhaps a shadowy hand directing the stage of existence. Fabric you call reality. This realization demands a reorientation of perspective. Reality is not a fortress guarded by a single gatekeeper. It is a living, shifting field shaped by countless participants. Governments, corporations, traditions, and technologies play their parts. But so do language, symbols, and cultural narratives. So do your perceptions, memories, and emotions. So do the stories humanity tells itself across centuries. Control, in this sense, is distributed, spread across layers of influence that overlap, contradict, and reinforce one another. It is not a throne you can topple, but a pattern you can learn to recognize. What does this recognition mean for you? It means that the old comfort of believing in absolute autonomy must give way to a more nuanced truth. You are never entirely free from influence, yet within those influences lies a space of agency. It is narrow, but it is real. The smallest act of conscious choice, turning your attention deliberately, questioning a narrative instead of absorbing it, choosing how to interpret an event, can ripple outward in ways you cannot measure. Control may be everywhere, but so is participation. The dream may be vast, but within it you can awaken. Consider again the allegories. The puppet master is real, but only in part. Strings do tug at your actions. But you are not only a puppet. The veil does conceal truth, but it can be lifted, even if only for moments. The labyrinth may confound you, yet learning its design gives you leverage. The mirror reflects your inner world, inviting you to take responsibility for what you bring into it. The dreamer reminds you that reality is not fixed. You have the capacity to become lucid within it. None of these narratives stand alone. Together, they form a composite picture of what it means to live within a controlled reality while still holding the possibility of transformation. Transformation here does not mean escape. It does not mean erasing all influence or shattering the structures of control. Instead, it means shifting the way you inhabit reality. It means learning to see the currents rather than being swept away by them. It means holding awareness in the midst of influence, clarity in the midst of confusion. Transformation is less about breaking chains than about recognizing that the chains are not the whole story. You can move within them differently, lightly, sometimes even slipping free without notice. The call, then, is not to rebellion in the dramatic sense, but to awakening in the subtle sense. It is a call to see reality as it is, not as a fixed stage, but as a malleable construction. Not as a single truth, but as layered perception. Not as a prison, but as a labyrinth that can be navigated. It is a call to participate consciously in the shaping of the story, rather than drifting passively through the narratives handed to you. It is a call to recognize that the question of who controls reality cannot be answered by pointing outward alone. It must also be answered by looking inward. Right now, reality is controlled by institutions, by cultures, by technologies, by invisible systems, but it is also controlled by your attention, your beliefs, your responses. The paradox is that you are both subject to control and part of the controlling process. Once you see this, you cannot return to the simple comfort of blame or resignation. You must take up the responsibility that comes with awareness, the responsibility to choose, however small the choice, in alignment with clarity rather than habit. If you take nothing else from this exploration, let it be this: reality is never entirely outside your hands. Influence is everywhere, but so is your power to shape how you live within it. You may not control the labyrinth, but you can choose how you walk its corridors. You may not dissolve the veil, but you can learn to glimpse what lies behind it. You may not silence the puppet master, but you can recognize the strings and decide when to resist their pull. You may not rewrite the dream, but you can awaken enough to realize you are dreaming. The transformation begins with a shift in attention. Where you place it, what you feed it, what you allow to anchor in your mind. These are acts of quiet creation. They may seem small, but they accumulate over time. They reshape the mirror of your world, altering what it reflects back to you, and in that reshaping lies the profound, humbling, and liberating truth. Reality is not controlled by a single hand, but by the interplay of countless forces, one of which is always you. So the call is simple, though never easy. Awaken to your participation. See the layers, notice the influences, claim the space you have, however narrow, to shape reality with clarity. The question of who controls reality right now will never have a final answer. But perhaps it was never meant to. Perhaps the true power lies not in discovering the master of the dream, but in recognizing yourself as part of its unfolding. The invitation stands before you, to live not as a passive character, but as a lucid participant, to step beyond the veil of unexamined assumptions, to walk the labyrinth with eyes open, to look into the mirror with honesty, and to awaken within the dream of reality itself.